Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm Tammy Stackelhouse, fibromyalgia coach, author, and founder of the International Fibromyalgia Coaching Institute. The goal of this podcast is to empower you with access to the dream team of experts and coaches I've discovered are key to living the fibro life you love. From the comfort of your own home, and maybe even your pajamas, I'll help you take back control of your life and health. To help out with FibroFog, I always include full show notes and additional resources at fibromyalgiapodcast.com. You're listening to the Fibromyalgia Podcast with Tammy Stackelhouse, episode 13. Welcome to the Fibromyalgia Podcast. I'm Tammy Stackelhouse, your coach. And today we're going to be walking through the joy list. Now, in a previous episode, I did get you started on the joy list, and today we are going to work through the entire worksheet. So what I would like you to do, if you haven't yet, is hit pause on this podcast episode and go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com/13. That's the number 13, 13. fibromyalgiapodcast.com/13 and download the worksheet for today's podcast. I want you to do that rather than just listening to me talk about it, because I want you to create your own joy list, and I want you to walk through the exercise with me and actually do the work yourself so that you end up adding in something to your life that you have that brings you joy that you've had to say no to. This is going to be something that you get to add back into your life. Now, this is an exercise that I have done in workshops all over the place. I actually did this recently on the Fibro Cruise. We called the workshop How to Add More Joy to Your Life Between Cruises. But I've done it on webinars, I've done it in person, and it's something that I think is very, very powerful and something that you can't just do once and be done, which is why I decided to create a podcast episode where I walk you through this exercise. It's an exercise that's also in my book. And with the podcast episode, my hope is that this is something that you can come back to and play again over and over as you need to add new fun things back into your life. So with that, I'm going to pause for a second, give you a chance to go download the worksheet at fibromyalgiapodcast.com/13. You'll see the joy list worksheet right there at the top in the show notes and the resources for this episode. It's a PDF file. Just download that and then come back and I will walk you through it. All right, awesome. So if you are continuing to listen, I'm going to assume that you have got the worksheet for the joy list in front of you. You can do this on your computer, or you can do this with pen and paper if you want to print it out. It is a fillable PDF, which means that you can type right on the PDF on your computer. Now, a couple episodes ago, I talked about having you start your joy list and start writing down the things that bring you joy. And I talked about the fact that the number one thing at the top of my list is rubbing the belly of happiness and joy. And at the beginning of this podcast episode, you might have heard some jingle bells in the background and thought maybe you were imagining something. That was actually my cat, Sam, who owns the belly of happiness and joy. He was sitting right here next to me as I started the podcast. I thought it was so appropriate, but then he got bored and jumped down and left. So the belly has left the room. But really, rubbing the belly of happiness and joy is simply petting the cat. But there is something about him, about his big round belly. He's a 20-pound Maine Coon, and he loves to have his belly rubbed. So it kind of reminds me of those big Buddha statues where you rub the belly for luck. Only I rub the belly for happiness and joy. So your joy list could include things that are as simple as that. They could be things like, getting a pedicure or massage, but they could also be things like going out for lunch with your girlfriends or hanging out with family or playing board games or, reading a trashy novel all day with no expectations to do anything else. It could be anything that you want it to be. In today's episode, I'm actually going to use the example of gardening because, first of all, when I do this exercise in groups, gardening is something that always comes up. At some point or another, somebody says gardening is something that they love to do, but that fibromyalgia is keeping them from doing. So I'm going to use that as today's example. But if you haven't, I want you to take a few minutes and try to jot down at least 10 things that you love to do. Now, on the worksheet, on the first page of the worksheet, you'll see it says at the top, My Joy List, and then it's got a bunch of blank lines. And on those blank lines is where I want you to jot down the things that bring you joy. If you've already written that down somewhere else, that's totally fine. But what I want you to do today, right now, if you haven't, is just, again, pause today's episode, just hit the pause button, and jot down at least 10 items that bring you joy. Now, I don't want you to edit this in any way. I want you to jot things down whether or not you can do them right now. All right? The point of this is to be thinking of things that you love to do, that feed your soul, that make you happy, that bring joy into your life and fill you up so that you have something to give. I don't want you to not write things down because you can no longer do it, because the whole point of this exercise is to figure out how to add those things back into your life, okay? So I really want you to not edit yourself and write them all down, all right? So again, just hit pause, and I want you to jot down at least 10 things. You can always come back to this episode in a little bit. All right. I'm going to assume, since you're continuing to listen, that you've got at least 10 things listed on your joy list. What we're going to do now is go to the second page of the joy list exercise. This is the page that has the line at the top that says, What brings me joy? And then there's a blank line. What I want you to do is I want you to look at page 1 from your joy list, and I want you to pick something from that list. For this podcast, I'm going to use the example of working in the garden. You pick whatever thing you want to pick. I would encourage you to pick something that you haven't been able to do in a while, and pick something that doesn't feel so easy that, it's like a no-brainer, I just need to do it more. Or pick something that's so hard that you have no idea how you're going to possibly do it. There's ways to add those things into your life too, but for now, while you're listening to this podcast, you're hearing my voice, but you don't have me answering questions for you. I want you to pick something that's kind of in the middle and just jot that down on your list. What is it that brings you joy? And again, I'm going to use the example of working in the garden. So pause the episode if you need to for a second and choose which thing you're going to work on. I want you to pick one to work on for this whole worksheet. You got your one thing? Okay. Now that we've identified the thing that brings you joy, in my case, I'm going to choose the thing of working in the garden. I want you to identify why it makes you happy or what it is about that activity that brings you joy. So using my example of gardening, I'm going to write down things like, I love when I can grow my own flowers to be able to just go out in the garden and cut flowers every day to have fresh flowers on the table at home. I love that. I love growing fresh vegetables in my own garden that I know are clean and healthy and good for my family. And I grew them myself. I don't have to go to the store and buy them. It's awesome. I love being outside in the fresh air. I love the feel of the sunshine. I love the feel of the wind on my skin, the gentle breeze. And I just love the smell of being outside. I love the smell of the dirt. I love like I said, the warmth of the sun on my skin. Today was a gorgeous day here in Seattle, so I'm particularly thinking of the warmth of the sun on my skin after a long winter. But I just love being outside. I love the fresh air. I love the smells, the sounds, the sights. I love being a co-creator with God. I love being a partner with Him in growing something. That idea of planting a seed and watching it grow and tending it and watering it and pruning and fertilizing and helping it grow into the best thing that it could be, and being a part of that, playing a little part of the creation story. And so for you, I want you, again, to just pause the episode real quick and think about that thing that you chose and what are the various aspects of that make you joy, that bring you joy. What makes you happy about that particular activity? Depending on what you chose, maybe some of the things that I just mentioned totally fit for you. Maybe there's other things. Maybe there's like being in community with others, or, if you're meeting friends for coffee, some of it may be the socialization, some of it may be the food, some of it may be, getting out of the house. There's so many things that it could be. So I want you to pause for a minute and just identify what those things are, why it is that activity just means so much to you. And this activity is one that we actually do with our clients as coaches. This is something I train my coaches on. So if you are listening to this podcast episode and you get really, really stuck and you want to talk to somebody about this, we can absolutely walk you through it. This helping people add things back into their lives is actually some of our favorite work to do as coaches. So again, just pause it and write down the things that make you happy about this particular activity. All right, you ready for the next step? All right. The next step is the one that I think most of us with fibromyalgia find the easiest, which is identifying all of the things that are getting in the way of you being able to do this activity. And this is going to be the most helpful if you are as specific as possible. So with my example of gardening, you don't get to write down fibromyalgia as a barrier. I need you to be super specific, okay? So, and I don't even want you to write down it hurts. I want you to write down very specifically what hurts, what's getting in the way, what's challenging. So with my example of gardening, here's some of the barriers that I might write down. One might be, I find the tools really difficult to use. So pruning shears, just like it hurts my hands to hold them and to squeeze them and to, prune things, like my hands hurt. I might write down that it's really difficult for me to bend over or be bent over for that long. Like I could bend over once, but like doing a whole garden plot of weeding is just like, forget it. Like my body is not going to bend over that long. It hurts. I might write down that it's too hard to get down on the ground and get back up again if I'm going to kneel down to do that weeding or planting. Then getting back up, it's just like it hurts my knees, it's hard to get up, the whole thing. You might write down that, I might write down that being outside, if it's too sunny, too hot, I burn super easy. You can tell, you can look at me, I'm very white. Those of you who are watching video can see. If you're on podcast, you might not. But I'm not out in the sun a lot. So if I do get out in the sun, I've got to be super careful that I don't burn. So I've got to be careful about that. I also have to be careful that I don't get too hot, because that is also going to trigger my symptoms. If I get too hot and sweaty, it throws my electrolytes off. I don't feel good. It gives me headaches if it's too bright outside. If it's too cold, my muscles get all tight and hurt that way. So, temperature wise, I've got to be super careful. There could be all kinds of things like that I write down in terms of gardening. I might put down that, the pots are too heavy. Like for me to go to Home Depot and buy pots and buy plants to bring them home and then pot them. It's just like physically too difficult for me, too heavy, too hard, too fatiguing. I might write down that, in order to have a big enough garden to grow vegetables for my family, it's just too much work. Like I can't keep it weeded enough. Like it's just like, that's a lot of work. So those could all be things that I write down in terms of barriers. You can also write down things. Now I'm going to put a little asterisk here, right? So in some ways, you can write down things like not having enough time. But I want you to be careful about how you write that down. I want you to write that down as an outside observer would write down, right? So we all have the same amount of time in a day. Like some of us don't get 8 days a week and others of us only get 6 or anything like that. Like we all have 24 hours in a day. We all have 7 days a week. Now, there may be other things going on in your life that leave you with not enough time to garden. But I want you to make sure that you write it down that way, that the obligations in my life, the things that I have already said yes to, if you remember from our last episode, we talked about saying no so that you could say yes. So if you've said yes to too many things, you might be saying no to the things that bring you joy. So I want you to write it down that way, that the obligations that you already have, the things you have already said yes to, mean that you don't have time to do this. But don't just write down that you don't have time, because we all have time. It's just how we're choosing to spend that time. I also want you to think about other intangible barriers, like psychological barriers. For instance, you might really love taking bubble baths, but one of the barriers for you is that you feel guilty taking time away from things for yourself. You may feel guilty sitting in the bathtub, letting the bubbles take away your stress. Without doing anything else, right? Like you might feel guilty taking that time for yourself. Write that down. That is absolutely a barrier. Just thinking in terms of baths, I'll give you a couple other examples because this is something for me. One of the barriers for me in taking baths was that the bathtub was never clean, or that after I did take a bath, then the bathtub was dirty and who was going to clean it, right? So make sure you write down all of those things with the barriers as well. Now, I want to point out that this part, like I said at the beginning, is usually the easiest for all of us with fibromyalgia. Like these are the things that we see the most. So if you aren't pausing this podcast episode like I'm telling you to work through the worksheet, I don't want you to go print the worksheet after the fact and start with the barriers. Do not do that. No. I want you to start with what makes you happy. I want you to start with what you want and then talk about the barriers to that. It's just too easy to talk about the things that get in the way, that it keeps our brains from thinking about the things that we want. So start with the things that you want. Start with the things that make you happy, and then work on the barriers, okay? So again, I want you to pause the podcast episode and I want you to go through and identify the barriers, identify the things that are keeping you from adding this activity more into your life. All right, you've got your barriers identified? Awesome. On the worksheet now, on the right-hand side of the page, opposite the barriers, you'll see where it says brainstorm modifications. Again, I'm going to use my example of gardening, and we're going to talk about those modifications. So one of the barriers that I mentioned was that my hands hurt in using some of the tools or in pruning, even if you're pruning by hand, for instance. So one of the things that we could do to modify that is we could go to the store and look for the Good Grips tools or other brands that have different grips that are actually made for people with arthritis or people who have a hard time gripping things. Actually makes it easier on your hands. So that's one of the modifications we could do. For some of the other modifications, like bending over to weed, one of the things that you might be able to do is use containers. Instead of having your garden in the ground, you could have raised beds, or you could use a tower garden. If you don't know what a tower garden is, I will have a link to that in the show notes. Just go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com/13, the number 13, and I'll have a link to tower gardens as well. There are lots of ways that you can basically take your garden and bring it up so that you don't have to bend over so far. And with the right containers, you can even sit in a chair or on a stool and work in front of you without having to bend over. The other thing that's super important as you're looking at these modifications is to go back to the list above where you wrote down the things that make you happy about this particular activity, where you identified why the activity makes you happy. And go for that feeling and go for those things more than just simply fixing the barriers. So I'll give you an example. With gardening, maybe one of the reasons that you love it is because you love having fresh flowers on the table and you love being able to go out in your garden and snip a few blooms and put them in a vase and have fresh flowers. One of the modifications that you can do, one of the ways you can get that same thing without doing the thing that hurts, is to buy fresh flowers, for instance. So when you do your grocery shopping, maybe you buy a bundle of fresh flowers. Or maybe you plant some flowers in pots that are on your kitchen counter or something. Like, there are other ways to get the same thing without doing the exact same activity. If with gardening, if one of the things you enjoy is being out in the sun, smelling the fresh air, feeling the breeze on your skin, maybe you go to the park and sit and have your lunch at the park like I did today. You can get that same feeling without the back-breaking work of weeding or lifting things that are too heavy or having to prune things that make your hands hurt. So go back to the why it is that you like that particular activity. This is why it's so important that you do that step first before you start looking at the barriers and the modifications. Because what we're going for, the thing that's the most important here, is how it makes you feel, right? So I'm going to give you a couple of other examples to give you an idea of how the modifications might work. For instance, one of the things I mentioned with gardening was that idea of being a co-creator with God and sort of participating in growing things, being part of making things grow. You could have plants indoor. You could have things on, grow herbs on your kitchen counter. You could, that idea of being a co-creator with God actually comes from one of my favorite authors, Madeline L'Engle, and she talks about that as an author being a co-creator with God. So this idea of creativity and helping bring something new into existence. Maybe you do that through art, or maybe you do that through crafts, or, there are lots of ways that you can get that same thing. We talked a second ago about bathtubs. One of the things that I learned was that if I wipe down the bathtub while I'm still in the bathtub, so as the water is draining out, I'll take my washcloth and I'll just wipe down the inside of the tub. It means the bathtub is cleaner and it's less backbreaking work to have it clean before I take my next bath. One of the things that I also do is, have I've done a couple of different things. One, I've used like the little Swiffer duster things to dust the hair out of. I shed a lot with my hair, so it helps me dust the hair out of the bathtub so it's ready for me to take a bath, or even use like a little portable vacuum to vacuum out the dust in the bathtub if it's been too long. And just having things handy and readily available. That helps with the idea of, I don't have time for this. I don't have enough time. If things are more readily available, if it's easier to do them, if the quote barrier to entry, we call it, if you can break down those barriers to entry to make it easier to do, then that helps. If there are things in there, like I mentioned, feeling guilty about taking time for yourself, sitting in a bubble bath, some of those things, when you're brainstorming your modifications, one of the things you write down that might be to, talk to your coach about it, or talk to a friend about it, or get some help in making that mindset shift from feeling guilty to realizing that you can't help others until you help yourself first. Maybe you go back and you listen to some of the earlier episodes of this podcast where we talk about that. But sometimes the things that you have to do are some of that internal work, mental and or physical. Maybe one of the things you love to do is go hiking. And so part of your barriers is that you're just physically not in shape to do that. And so one of the modifications, one of the things that you can do is find a fibro-friendly exercise routine that can help you build up your strength and your stamina. There are some out there. If you're looking for them, just let me know. I'm happy to help you. I'll even link to one in the show notes for this episode. But there are lots of things like that that you can do. If you have trouble with the modifications, this is honestly an area where a coach can be super, super helpful. This is one of the things that we do where we basically help our clients think outside of the box. This is my favorite thing to do with my private clients, is to help them figure out new ways of doing things, new ways to structure their life, new techniques or strategies for doing the same thing. So this brainstorming modifications is something that coaches in particular are actually trained in, and we can help you figure out how to do. So again, you know what I'm going to say next, right? I want you to pause the episode and I want you to brainstorm the modifications for you. And as you are looking at those modifications, don't just look at the barriers and how do you fix that particular barrier, because it might be something you can't fix. For instance, right? If you've got bad knees and you're kneeling on the ground, there's no way to make kneeling on the ground better. So what we do is we actually just do something different, right? That's where we bring the dirt up to you so you don't have to kneel, or we figure out another way to get to the why, right? The things that you wrote down for why that particular activity makes you happy. So make sure you look at both the barriers and the why, okay? So pause and write down your modifications. All right. So you got your modifications all brainstormed there. Now, the final step to this exercise is adding a tiny piece of this activity back into your life. And that is the part at the bottom, which is adding it in as a goal. So we could go through this entire worksheet here. We could come up with, buying flowers at the store. We could come up with going to the farmer's market and buying produce that was grown in somebody's garden. It just didn't happen to be yours. We could figure out how to do container gardens. We could figure out how to grow plants inside. We could figure out all of these awesome things. But if you don't actually do it, what's the point, right? So I want you, and in this next step, to figure out one or two tiny little things that you can do to start adding this back into your life. Now, on the worksheet, you'll notice that it says adding in as goals. So if you were a client of mine and I was doing this exercise with you, I would be saying, what is something that you want to accomplish between now and when you and I talk again? That's what I say to my clients. For you, I just want you to think about something that you can accomplish in the next 1 to 2 weeks, just 1 to 2 weeks, to add this back into your life. So you're not going to write in on here, I'm going to do a 5K, unless you are physically in a place where you can do a 5K in 1 to 2 weeks, okay? Now, it's totally fine if you have big goals that you're working towards, but the purpose right now on this exercise and this worksheet is for you to pick something that you can do in the next 1 to 2 weeks. So sometime in the next 14 days before the next podcast episode comes out. You'll also notice that it says on the worksheet in parentheses, it says be or do. And what this refers to is that with goals, we have two different kinds of goals. We have be goals and we have do goals. So you might have heard the thing, we are human beings, not human doings. And all that's referring to is that we get so caught up in I've got to do this, I've got to do that, we've got a to-do list. We look at these goals and we think, what am I going to do? I've got to go buy flowers. I've got to, create, I've got to buy different tools to use when I'm gardening. I've got to buy flowers for the table. I've got to go have lunch at the park. Those are all things that you're doing. But you also need the being part, which is just the rest part of this. It could also be the things that you're going to stop doing, right? So it might be, in order to add this thing back into my life, I need to notify this group over here that I'm not going to be able to do their thing. So it might be something you stop doing. It might be a mindset shift, right? So it might be something like, I'm going to remind myself that I can't help anybody else if I don't help myself first. So I am going to take a moment every day to just remind myself of that. So make sure that you're thinking about your goals from all of those perspectives, not just making yourself another to-do list, because we all have way too much to do. What we really need is to do more being. We need to do more just relaxing into life and becoming the person who has the life that we want to have, which is a very nebulous concept. I know this podcast episode is not about that. So I apologize if that's a thought that you're like, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Tell me more. We will get to that in future episodes. But I just want to plant this idea of the fact that you're not just a human running around doing things. but you're also a human being. And so what is it that you need to be? Do you need to be more grateful? Do you need to be more concerned about yourself and focus on taking care of your needs so that you can take care of others? What do you need to be as well as what do you need to do? All right. With that, you should have one or two, at the most two. If you guys, if any of you have seen the show What About Bob? Baby steps down the hall, baby steps across the street. Yes, this is all about baby steps. So break it down small enough that you can actually accomplish your goal in the next 7 to 14 days. And then I want you to just have one or two things to do. When I'm working with my clients, I'm actually usually telling them to do less, not telling them to do more. So I'm telling you that right now because I just bet that probably, 80% of you have written down too much under your goals. And so I want you to cut that in half. And we are going to be building the habit of actually accomplishing your goals, not just setting goals that you don't accomplish. All right. And again, if you need any help with this, if you want to talk to somebody, if this is just really, really hard for you, this idea of adding more joy in, brainstorming modifications, figuring out how to add things back into your life, if that just gets your brain and your heart wrapped up in knots, then please reach out to us. I would love to match you up with one of my coaches, have a consultation with you, and really just help you do this. It is totally possible to have a life you love, even with fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia can help you have a life that you love. I believe that with all of my heart. And I talked about that on the last episode, about the gifts that fibromyalgia give us. And I know for some of you, this is really hard to hear because that's not the place that you're at. But hopefully you will keep listening to this podcast, start internalizing some of this, start utilizing the strategies that we have, reach out and get the help that you need so that you can start feeling better. And if you just really, really don't believe this, that's totally fine too. But this won't be the podcast for you because this is the focus that we have here on how you can live a fibro life you love and how you can feel better. All right. I would love to hear from you guys. I would love to even see your Joy List worksheets. If you go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com under contact, there's a place where you can send me a message. You can also find the Fibromyalgia Podcast on Facebook. I would love to get a message from you and just see your Joy List and see what you're working on. I would be happy to, give you some feedback or just celebrate with you as you start adding things back into your life. And in upcoming episodes, just to kind of give you a sneak preview, I'm going to be having one of my coaches, Julie Hamilton, is going to be joining us, and we're going to be talking about the Family Medical Leave Act. Julie has been working with the FMLA since it was created. She was an HR director and manager for over 20 years before fibromyalgia entered her life. She is now a certified fibromyalgia coach, a certified life coach, and a certified youth life coach. And she is taking all of her experience and combining it all together and bringing us amazing information that is so helpful for those of us with fibromyalgia who are working on what our rights are, what the laws are around disabilities and around the Family Medical Leave Act, and with getting special accommodations at work, what you shouldn't tell your boss, what you don't have to tell your boss when you're doing, I even want to ask her about doing interviews, like if you're looking for a job, what you should and shouldn't say. So we are actually going to do 2 podcast episodes with Julie, simply because I know we have so much information information to cover, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to do that without totally overwhelming you in one episode. So we'll have 2 episodes with Julie. We also have a bunch of other goodies coming up, so stay tuned. Be sure and subscribe so that you get our episodes as soon as they come out. And as always, go to fibromyalgiapodcast.com to get full show notes, the transcript, the video, all of the links and the resources. There's also copies of my books you can request for free. You can download a free copy of my book. And the exercise that we just went through today, the Joy List exercise, is in my first book, Take Back Your Life. You can get a free copy out there. And of course, the worksheet, which you should have by now if you did what I told you to and stopped the podcast episode to go get it. All right, you guys, I will see you back here in a couple of weeks when we have our next episode. And in the meantime, be as well as possible and add more joy into your life wherever you can, with the simple things and with the more complex things. And if you need any help at all, just reach out. Bye. And that wraps up another episode of the Fibromyalgia Podcast. If you're ready to see if working with a fibromyalgia coach can help you feel better faster, visit fibromyalgiapodcast.com, where you can schedule a complimentary consultation to explore your options. During this call, we'll discuss your fibromyalgia journey, what your needs and challenges are, and give you recommendations on how to reach your goals the quickest way possible. Thank you for tuning in today, and join us next time as we explore more ways to help you take back control of your life and health. My music and sound editing were done by Daniel Munkus at Subtle Soup Records. Podcast management and creative copy by Sonia Louise of Performance Podcasting.